Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another live stream here on the Monticello Facebook page. My name is Steve Light. I'm the manager of house tours here at Monticello. And during our live stream today, we're going to be taking a closer look at the material world of Thomas Jefferson's cabinet and library, the interconnected spaces that made up his private study at Monticello. We are lucky to be joined today by Monticello's Associate Curator of Decorative Arts, Diane Ehrenpreis, who will be sharing with us her expertise about the recent restoration of these spaces at Monticello. And she'll be talking with us about how curators select objects to facilitate conversations, not just about Thomas Jefferson at Monticello, but also about the larger world of Monticello's enslaved and free residents. Diane is joining us from her home office. Welcome, Diane. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation. It's really lovely to see a colleague, at least virtually. And indeed, I'm working from home in the Shenandoah Valley, but we also want to be mindful of all our friends and loved ones who are in a much more difficult situation throughout this whole unprecedented crisis. So thinking of all of you too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, to begin our conversation today, Diane, can you tell us first just a little bit about your background as a curator and your role at Monticello?
Yeah, I have a BA in art history, so I come at it from sort of an aesthetic point of view, and I've been working at Monticello for 19 years, close to 20. Both as a research assistant and now as this curatorial position as an associate, particularly working on decorative arts and interiors. Some of the experiences I brought to Monticello, I gained as a grad student up in Boston at BU, and worked at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, Historic New England. So always my interest has been American decorative arts and interiors, and old houses are the thing for me. So I'm perhaps in the catbird seat here with working all these years at Monticello.
Well, and in your role at Monticello a few years back, you were the project point person for the restoration of the private suite. And I know during that project, you spent literally hours alone in those rooms, trying to get a sense for what they might have been like during Thomas Jefferson's lifetime. Can you talk to us about some of the discoveries you made and maybe some of the revelations that you had while you were spending time in those spaces?
It wasn't sort of a 9-to-5 experience. There were times when I would be there early in the morning, which is not my best time. Later in the evening, when the shutters are being closed, sometimes the rooms were empty or partially furnished under work by our restoration team. And through all those experiences, I had all sorts of revelations. So it was really kind of a journey. So it was exciting to really be able to appreciate the amazing craftsmanship that went into the trim work and so on, the ideas about the furnishings that Jefferson used in there, commissioned and then moved around as he needed. But I also had to think about how this was all made possible. It was increasingly almost frustrating for me to realize that this important monument that Jefferson was really building as far as his ideas about architecture and innovation and systems was underpinned by the institution of slavery. And at any given time at Monticello, there were approximately 130 enslaved men, women, and children working there to support the system that funded his experimentation in architecture. So initially, I spent a lot of time working on objects and bringing original furnishings back to the collection. And one of the main reasons why these things were lost is that Jefferson was in debt when he died, and there was a sale. So as an art historian, I'm thinking, I cannot believe that this amazing secretary bookcase has gone missing. But of course, that just pales in comparison to the human story of all of the individuals who also were auctioned off at this sale in 1827. So really, you know, an enlightening experience to think about these things. And it also speaks to the power of place. You know, you can read about it, but standing in this space and working it through for myself, both from objects to the human story, was very powerful.
Yeah, it speaks to the power of place and how a place like Monticello and some of the objects in Monticello can have such complicated stories that tell different points of view depending on who you look at. I want to talk a little bit about one of the topics that you researched exhaustively as part of this project. I know that you started to become interested in Jefferson's very particular system, if you will, of correspondence. How did you become fascinated in this particular facet of Jefferson?
So in being able to spend time researching and thinking about all of the different tasks that Jefferson undertook in these rooms, the objects that survive, specialized tables and books and papers, I sort of, maybe a little self-righteously, wanted to expand the narrative beyond what is most famous for any visitor to Monticello, what really resonates with people, what they remember after coming to see Jefferson's home. And that would be what I'm calling his writing workstation, which is something of a modern term, but in some ways very applicable to what Jefferson devised for himself. And there you can see the view of the cabinet as it looks today with this writing workstation front and center. And of course, people talk about the polygraph machine where he can write one letter and end up with an exact copy at the same time. And I was hoping to sort of expand maybe even redirect the attention to some of these other stories. But in spending time with my colleagues in EVP as they're working with the public and hearing what the public is talking about, I realized that in some ways, this is absolutely spot on. We think of Jefferson as a writer. We know of him as the writer of the Declaration of Independence. And, you know, who can top someone who's participated in a correspondence that numbers close to 40,000 letters? It was vital to who he was, important to keep in touch with family, political, you know, compatriots, scientists. It was just absolutely about who he was and what his work was during his time at Monticello. So with that in mind, I thought, well, then how in the world can I explain some of these unusual pieces of furniture? Why are there terms that he uses in his correspondence? Like he uses the term carton for something that's storing his letters. And we didn't know what that was until we started working on this project. So that was the impetus, to get in there and understand. There were just some unanswered questions and clues, right? There were great little nuggets that caught my eye. And I thought, okay, something is going on here. I need to figure it out.
Yeah, so maybe you could walk us through kind of what that system was, tell us about some of these specialized objects and how Jefferson used them, and why he had to have this system for his writing.
Okay, well, maybe we'll do the why first. The why, of course, as I said, he is this voluminous correspondence. Only Ben Franklin, as a contemporary, came anywhere near the paper trail that Jefferson had. And I encourage all of us to think about our email inboxes or our voice messages or our texts to even have a small comparable of the amount of information ingoing and outgoing that Jefferson had to deal with. And so He needed a system. He also was very much a man of the Enlightenment as far as this optimistic belief that whatever task you undertake, that you might indeed be able to find a better method for doing it. You can improve on it. And particularly in the area of efficiency, Jefferson was very interested in making sure that whatever job he was doing could be done with the least amount of wasted time or even, we'll see, motion. His grandson-in-law called him an economist of space. So he's always trying to make the best use of both the physical space in the room, but making his objects, his furnishings work to the maximum. So what we ended up realizing is that there was a counterpart to the writing workstation, which is what I'm calling the incoming mail workstation. And there were a couple of unusual pieces of furniture that he used to make this new system work for him. And I think you might have a view of the library. Yeah, there it is. This is a very singular piece of furniture. There's, I'm sure no one else had one of these. I'm pretty sure this is actually something that Jefferson designed and invented. He was inspired by pieces of furniture that lawyers and men in France who dealt with a lot of paper, they had this form called a pupitre and cartonnier, which really means like a small desk with cartons, filing boxes, which you can see there in this piece. There's these blue boxes. So Jefferson didn't adapt this sort of piece of furniture that had to stay in one place. Instead, he played with it. He came up with a square form. He had it on a pedestal base, and then introduced these file boxes where he would keep correspondence, maybe kind of as a holding tank. And we think that he kept his summary journal of letters here to log them in as mail arrived, so he could keep track of it. We didn't know anything about this table until I started really scrutinizing a drawing that survived. It's written in French, and it's at UVA. We looked at it many times. For people who enjoy antique furniture or classical designs, this looks very much like a sort of 1820s ladies' work table, until I actually noticed how big it was. It's only about 22 inches tall. So you can see why it's so low next to his chair. This is the original. Well, I should clarify, this one is actually only partly French. You can see the measurements are in French. But this is his original commission drawing with notations that he would have given to a craftsman. And we know that this piece was made in Paris around 1785 or 6 and brought back with him as part of his writing rig.
Very cool. And we had a comment come in from Wendy, not really a question, but she mentioned, and I figured I'd pass on to you, that she's seen the cabinet evolve many times over the years, and she is 100% set that the current setup that you've designed is her favorite. So,
oh, well, we appreciate all of our members and supporters who follow our work. And none of us like to work in a an echo chamber. So having the public come or seeing these things virtually and giving us some feedback is invaluable. It's very exciting. Thank you, Wendy.
I'm kind of curious, it seems like so much paper. So, we know that Jefferson wrote somewhere around 19,000 letters that we know of. And then I know if you include all of the papers that he's receiving, estimates seem to indicate that there's something like 40,000 documents that Jefferson either writes or receives during his lifetime. And the majority of these documents still exist.
Yes.
Talk to us about how he managed that.
Well, this was a little bit of a mystery. There were many people who had pieced most of it together, and perhaps, my great legacy in life will be those file boxes, what Jefferson called cartons. But that is really what made it all possible for him. He, perfect, thank you. So what he ended up doing, that first piece was, we think, the first time he used these, they're really cardboard boxes with either leather or marbleized paper covers. And he continues to order them from his bookbinders at least one other time in his life. So essentially, he organized the papers chronologically, and then also by wherever he was living at the time. So we'll just say all the papers from Paris were all sort of, 1784 to 89 would have all been within, one, what he would call a filing press, which you're seeing here on the screen. It's a very simple walnut, cherry, mahogany, rectangular box. I have to say, as a furniture person, looking at the arrangement of those shelves, I just scratched my head for a number of years. It's very unusual to have, have such narrow shelves, have, 5 of them, very odd spacing, until I realized, oh my goodness, those are standardized sizes. That's where he would store the paper cartons. Cartons fit perfectly into the box. We had dimensions for a later size. And what was really exciting, once we had one made, you can see our test case of what they would have looked like in the press. We really can now pay more attention. Jefferson, on some of the presses that survive, and there were 8 total, by the way, on the door, there's still some of his notations about which box went where, because of course, it has to go back in the right place or he wouldn't be able to find the information held within. So it was very helpful both to sort of finalize that last piece of how he stored the correspondence. And I will also add, using these cartons is very clever because there are no loose paper shuffling around. He could pull out whatever file he wanted, use it. He could reorganize these boxes. He could take a box and maybe, do some writing on the terrace with his lap desk. They were, extremely wise choice for someone with this much paper. And then we might say, well, all right, we always credit Jefferson with, numerous innovations and successes. But I was excited to have a visitor account where a young man came and said, do you happen to have this legal document from my father years ago? And Jefferson said, well, if I have that document, I will be able to retrieve it in just 1 minute. And the young man describes how he went to a cupboard, how he rifled around, and how he pulled out a document and turned around and sure enough was able to give him the paper and information that he wanted in just 1 minute. So, wow. That part worked.
Yeah.
And sadly, we have the presses, but we don't have any original cartons surviving. So these are adaptations. And I want to say that amazing hand marbled paper is based on original paper surviving in Jefferson's some of his own books from the same bookbinder.
And fascinating story. We had a follow-up question, by the way, from Wendy, more of a personal question, asking, in your years at Monticello, what is your favorite piece that you've found or restored at Monticello?
Oh, let's see. I'm not so great at thin air. Let's see here. Well, I'm pretty excited about Campeche chair work and sorting out some of those examples of seating furniture. I do really get great pleasure out of using these original commission documents that we have from Jefferson and recreating lost objects, in part hoping it will spur visitors to say, oh my goodness, I think I may have that, which has happened one time. We had a visitor come through on a tour She was in the parlor. She noticed our French mahogany armchairs and said, I have one of those. And we all know antiquers, right? They always say, oh, my grandmother had that. But she, our wonderful colleague guide, followed up. And indeed, she had a chair from this set, and it led us into a whole new discovery about objects and
Wow.
their histories.
Yeah. Thinking about the private suite and the cabinet in the library, you were talking a lot about all this paper and how Jefferson has this extremely organized system. If you had to like describe these spaces during Jefferson's time, would you describe them as kind of neat and tidy where everything has a place, or is this going to be a cluttered space for Jefferson?
Well, I think that they weren't quite as tidy, especially as the years went on. There were fewer places to put things. The library is a good example. We've tried to add more paper, isn't extra pamphlets are sitting on the floor and so on. And we know that Dick the Bird, you can see a little sculpture representing Dick the Bird on top of the secretary there. It was Jefferson's trained pet mockingbird, had the run of the private suite and could fly around. And I'm sure that that caused a lot of chaos and mess as well. But this makes me think of a wonderful quote where we've all forgotten our homework at home, but speaks to everything wasn't always put away. Jefferson goes to Washington and forgets some papers, and he writes really in a panicked tone back to his son-in-law saying, please, I need these papers. They're in the carton by the window, where I usually sit and write, which tells me that the carton with the letters hadn't been put away. They weren't locked up. They were kind of sitting around. So definitely not, a clean sweep every day. Very personalized space, I think. A little quirky.
And the other question I'm curious about with this is in thinking about the privacy of the space. At being Jefferson's private suite, we always tend to think of this space as a place where Thomas Jefferson is alone, which obviously when he's working, when he's writing, is the case. But who else, among the people living at Monticello had access to this space and would have been in this space frequently?
So a visitor called it his sanctum sanctorum, and it was locked. He would lock himself in there and really control access. His daughter, Martha Jefferson Randolph, could interrupt him. She would go in from time to time, but definitely controlled space. Visitors, we know, of course, Lafayette or his friend Madison frequently were invited in there. Overseer, and really in working on this project, one of the most detailed accounts is from Israel Gillette, who as a young man describes, being in there regularly, perhaps multiple times a day, setting the fire, bringing in wood, setting the fires. He talks about cleaning things and tidying things, arranging things, ushering in guests, and sometimes even lingering in the space if he hasn't been, told to leave or dismissed. He would hear conversations and, may have been a vital sort of connection to the enslaved community, knowing what's happening in Jefferson's world. So, and then, of course, we know from Madison Hemings that Sally Hemings was responsible for tidying his space. And really, Burrell Colbert also would have been in there and in the bedchamber, perhaps most often doing work we would think of that a valet would do. And to try and spark conversation about these individuals, we, again, use objects. For Burrell Colbert, we have a reproduction of Jefferson's coat and a brush, a clothes brush, to indicate, if a visitor is curious or if a guide wants to use those objects to try and tell that story about Burrell, we've provided these, objects that would signal some of these stories. Pages from the farm book that talk about lists of slaves and so on, as well as things like putting a cushion on Jefferson's settee where I know he would nap, so that people maybe don't even hear that story, but kind of recognize that, that this might be indeed where Jefferson take a little rest from the writing table.
We have a question from Susan, who's asking if you can comment on some of the different specialized workstations within the space. So obviously you have the writing setup that we're looking at here, but there's an architect's table. We have the secretary as well. Did they all work in tandem, or were those separate kind of stations for Jefferson?
So perhaps if we could go back to the view of the library, that would be great. If it's not too much trouble. The secretary bookcase is a piece that we really recently pinned down, that we know that he had this piece. It's really kind of a gentleman's high style object, not singular to Jefferson. And he would have acquired that in New York around 1790. But that might be where he would have kept maybe the documents for running the plantation, is what we're wondering. And then you can see in the middle of this image, we have the sort of bones of the incoming mail workstation, where this table served as a filing table. Those tiny letters of the day could fit in these small alphabetized drawers. And for viewers, when you come again, or as you visit our website and see full views of the room, in this same space, we have arranged Jefferson's, what we think of as his drafting table that he acquired in France, where he probably did this very important work, sort of his labor of his final years, designing the grounds at the University of Virginia, and of course, even founding the University of Virginia. So really purpose, very intentional, very careful to have spaces that to suit the job at hand. And I don't know that we've talked about one feature that Jefferson really valued that we take for granted, which is many of these pieces, including this octagonal table, the odd little square piece. Maybe we can show the image of the 5-winged stand and revolving chair. All of these things revolve, and they're on casters. So that immediately signals what Susan's getting at, that these are multifunctional pieces. The revolving stand here could be low, like a table. We know from ink stains that Jefferson would have sat and written at this, but we also know he could pull it up next to the writing table and have drafts of letters, or have the letter that he's replying to sit right next to him, because when we see the writing table with the polygraph, there's not a lot of room for the letters and papers and books on that table. And again, with the revolving chair, it's on casters, and he really thought about these things as multifunctional and interlocking almost objects. In his day, something like the stand here, they called that metamorphic furniture, things that would metamorphosize or convert into something different. So it's just the kind of notion that I think Jefferson, the person who's so interested in the, economist of space and efficiency, really took delight in. Steve,
Yes.
I was going to bring up something, but you go ahead.
I was just going to ask, going from these kind of specific examples to kind of this broader story, if you could talk to us a little bit about, I often think of curators as history detectives, right? You're using objects to learn more about people. Can you talk to us a little bit about the process that you use to kind of examine these objects and come to these conclusions?
So my process frequently starts with actually documents. I refer to Jefferson's memorandum book and purchases he's made, and his own correspondence, the letters that the family wrote. We're really valuing their sort of personal conversations back and forth about furnishings at Monticello and visitors. And then that kind of gives me a framework, and I start thinking about time and place and where things might have gone in the house. But for example, you really spent a lot of time looking at that writing setup. It became clear to me that something like the revolving chair, he could not get out of that chair unless he was able to push it way back and then turn, which sounds kind of, in the weeds, very specialized kind of way of thinking about things. But it gives me great amount of information about how the room worked, how Jefferson's body moved through space and used this object and writing system. And this is not singular to this high-end furniture or this, special World Heritage site. This is applicable to all of our lives and the things that we value or maybe have hung on to. My comparable example would be my father's beat up upholstered chair that he would read in. But there are also cues that I could take away from that if I never knew who owned it or used it. So I'm hoping that, in this conversation today, as we talk about the furnishings at Monticello, all of you could also start thinking about your own environment and your own objects and bring that to the conversation.
Excellent. Well, I think we have time for just one more question, Diane.
Okay.
I was hoping you could just talk to us a little bit about, how did you first become interested in history and this historic house?
I was that kid. Mother's Day is coming, and all I could say is thanks, Mom. Thanks, Mom. My mother was an antiquer, and we used to go to the back, in the Midwest, go to large, Saturday, Sunday open air antique shows. And then I became an antiquer as a sad little child. And then as I thought about a career change, leaving the business world, I really wanted, my dream would be to work in a historic house, which I realize now as a young person and going to visit a Frank Lloyd Wright home or Ulysses Grant's home in Galena with my parents, that it's the power of place. And I am really energized by having that experience of being in a room where people lived, having the original objects there, and then being able to tell the entire story. So, yeah. You never know what kind of trouble your mom's going to get you into years down the road, but listen to your mother.
Absolutely. I second those comments. Well, Diane, thank you so much for spending time with us here today to talk to us a little bit about the cabinet in the library. It's great to see a colleague, even from the,
I agree.
really appreciate it.
If you all are like me and you come up and think about something that occurs to you down the line, please send along a query or a comment on Facebook, and we'll try and answer that for you. So everybody stay well. Thanks for the invitation. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you as well. And for those of you watching on Facebook, don't forget that we have another live stream tomorrow on our Teach Monticello Facebook page, which will also be, I believe, tomorrow at 1 p.m. as well. Thank you all for joining us, and so long.